Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, January 30th, 2022, and today we are going to be talking about the Texas gubernatorial race between Greg Abbott and Beto O'Rourke, which is expected to be potentially a competitive governor's race in which Beto O'Rourke is one of the best performing Democrats in recent political history in the state of Texas. Now, taking a look at the polling averages, one thing that you might realize is that Greg Abbott has a lead of 7.2%. Now, for reference, Donald Trump won the 2020 election in the state of Texas by a margin of 5.6. He won in the state of Texas in 2016 by 9 percentage points. So the state of Texas hasn't really been opposed to electing Republicans in the past, as Beto O'Rourke can tell you. He lost the competitive Senate election against Ted Cruz in 2018 by a margin of just under 3 percentage points. Now, Greg Abbott individually is a candidate who did outperform expectations when compared to the rest of the candidates on the statewide level. In the state of Texas in 2018, despite the national environment being pro for the Democratic Party and the Democratic Party doing substantially better than they have in decades in the Senate elections, Greg Abbott still defeated his opponent in the governor's race by a margin of over 13 percentage points across the state. Now, 2018 was definitely a year where the Democratic Party in Texas really gave the GOP a run for their money. They did very well in the House elections, and they were poised with expectation to pick up many seats in 2020, specifically from the state of Texas. Looking at all of those close races, Democrats had really turned the state of Texas into a purple state, and 2018 was concrete evidence that the state itself was no longer ruby red as Republicans like to have hoped. Now, Greg Abbott was a bit of an exception. His margin here was pretty substantial, and his 2014 margin was even more impressive. Now, keep in mind there was a big difference between the 2014 national environment and the 2018 one. 2014, the Republican Party kept control of the House and won back control of the Senate. In 2018, the Republicans, while still keeping control of the Senate, lost control of the House and lost the popular vote in the House election by a margin of about 8 percentage points. And the fact that there were a significant amount of Beto O'Rourke, Greg Abbott voters is a testament to his previous electability. Now, Greg Abbott has been facing a lot of issues now that he is the incumbent governor. He has been facing the issues of infrastructure and the power grid that were extremely crucial during the Texas snow crisis back in early 2021. And all of those things combined with the fact that the GOP's image has sort of shifted away from the way that Greg Abbott had previously campaigned is quite interesting. Now, Greg Abbott himself, I wouldn't exactly say is the best campaigner or the best orator or really just the most exquisite when it comes down to GOP campaigning. I think Donald Trump has really honed in onto a certain type of crowd, and that crowd is replicated across all of the Republican rallies that we have seen across this nation. Now, I don't think that means that all of a sudden Greg Abbott is going to lose this race. I just do think that it is something to say that Greg Abbott isn't exactly as appealing to Texas voters as someone who campaigns similar to Donald Trump might be, who just doesn't necessarily have the track record of Donald Trump. But the thing is, after the infrastructure, collapse with the power grid and, the snow crisis, things like that are always remembered by voters in a state. It was a huge crisis, and voters were really put in a position where they had, to bundle up. They had to cower in their homes, and they had to remain prepared because the state itself did not provide them with the infrastructure and the power sustainability to keep them warm. And people did end up dying. People were harmed. People were hospitalized as a result of it. And it all was a negative reflection on Governor Greg Abbott. So now that he's returning to a third term, all of the polling data seems to indicate that he is in a more competitive race than the past two elections. One thing that I do want to say is that the state of Texas is also more pro-Democratic than it has been in the past two elections. Taking a look at 2014, the Democrats had just lost the state of Texas by 16 points in 2012, so there was no expectation for Democrats in 2014. In 2016, it narrowed up. Hillary Clinton only lost the state by 9 percentage points, but even then, 9 points was right around the corner from 10. And if the Democrats were to have a candidate that wasn't, the GOP was to have a candidate that wasn't Donald Trump, there was an expectation that they would perform better than Donald Trump did in 2016. Greg Abbott did, Ted Cruz did not. But the state itself had already made a significant shift. The fact that the Senate race in the state of Texas was competitive was fascinating and really an important deal. It was a huge thing for Democrats that Beto O'Rourke came within just 3 percentage points of defeating Senator Ted Cruz, one of the most recognizable names at the time in the United States Senate on the GOP side. So now that we fast forward to 2022, what we see now in this new University of Houston poll is that Greg Abbott only maintains a 5-point lead over Beto O'Rourke. O'Rourke. That's down from Quinnipiac saying that he was up 15 points, the Dallas Morning News saying he was up 6 points, the University of Texas / Texas Tribune poll showing him up 9 points, and Rice University showing Abbott up 1 percentage point. Now, with the University of Houston poll, the reason why I'm pointing it out is because it is the only poll of the actual election year for this race. It is the only poll that has been taken in 2022 and published. And when looking at the 2020 election results in the state of Texas, I looked at the polls to see if I could find a University of Houston poll. What I found was that Quinnipiac surprisingly actually overestimated Biden's support, but one pollster was right on the money. Keep in mind that Donald Trump won by 5.6%. It says 5.8 here, but New York Times says 5.6. But the University of Houston said that Donald Trump was going to win by 5 points. He won by 5.6. It was in fact the most accurate poll besides the other one from the University of Texas / Texas Tribune poll that was taken a little bit earlier on, but the University of Houston poll was the most accurate and the most recent when it came down to the state of Texas's election results. Quite interesting, if you ask me. And seeing that they have now released a new poll from the state of Texas in the governor's race, it tells me that they have done something right. When they take a look at the previous election and they have been able to accurately estimate who was going to win and by what margin, you begin to gain and improve your own I guess, ability to be recognized as a reputable pollster. You increase your reputation and you put yourself in a position where your words and your polling numbers are going to become potentially a reality. And that's what could happen in this state. Now, the other poll that was right on the money was the University of Texas / Texas Tribune poll, but this one was actually taken back in October of 2021. So national and environmental circumstances in the state of Texas certainly could have changed voters' minds by a substantial amount. But the University of Texas Texas Tribune poll showed Greg Abbott ahead by 9 percentage points. But what we find here is that there's an improvement on both sides in this new University of Houston poll. Obviously there's an improvement on the Democratic side, but there's also an improvement on the Republican side. Greg Abbott goes from 46% in the University of Texas poll to 48% in the University of Houston poll. Beto O'Rourke at 37% up to 43% now. So both parties seem to have benefited from the increase in months and the closer proximity to the election, primarily because voters are being now forced to make a decision. If you take a look at that first poll from Rice University on October 14th through the 27th, what you found was that there were nearly 20% of voters here that were undecided. That's a substantial amount. Once you get closer to an election, you will have much less undecided voters because people are going to be forced to take a side. Now, the University of Houston poll isn't exactly going to be the gold standard when it comes down to polling data. It is a B/C rated pollster, so I'm not going to take this and say, all of a sudden that this is the gold standard, this is a 100% accurate pollster, but it did get it right in 2020, and I think that is something to point out. 538 doesn't have that 2020 poll. I'm not entirely sure why, but they do have one poll from 2016 where they predicted that Ted Cruz was going to win by 15 points. He ended up winning by 17 points. So sometimes the University of Houston is correct, and I do think that should be acknowledged. And when looking at the data and looking at the survey population demographics, because that is always important in ensuring that the state itself was fairly represented in the poll, they found that of those who voted in the 2020 election, they responded that they voted 46% for Donald Trump and 41% for Joe Biden. That is a 5-point margin, whereas Donald Trump won by 6 points. Looking at the actual results, what you found is that 52% voted for Trump and 46% voted for Biden. So when you sort of shifted up just a few percentage points on both sides, you actually reach your point where this is nearly identical to where it was in the 2020 election when Donald Trump defeated Joe Biden by a margin of 5.6%. Just interesting, if you ask me. So we know that they've gotten the survey demographics and the population at least somewhat correct, and I think that is impressive in on itself. I think that, of course, that is something that is routine in pollsters, but now that we have a pollster that has shown itself to be accurate in 2016 and 2020, it might be somewhat trustworthy to look at for 2022. Again, not the gold standard, but it is the only data that we have of this election year for the 2022 Texas race, which is going to be competitive even if the GOP does end up having a red wave. What you find is that as you scroll down, we're going to ignore the primaries because we don't really need to spend too much time. I mean, what you find is that Beto O'Rourke is, for sure going to win the GOP nomination. You're going to see, Greg Abbott defeat Allen West. But the numbers here are fascinating, if you ask me. The fact is that there are voters here that are voting for Beto O'Rourke, voting for Greg Abbott, and it's by a margin that is nearly identical to where it was in 2020 when it came down to the presidential margin. And I think that itself also is a testament to the state getting bluer and shifting towards the left. When you take a look at the elections like the one in 2014 or 2018, what you will find is that between the two, you still see an overperformance for the GOP relative to the last presidential election cycle. Greg Abbott outperformed Donald Trump's 2016 margin. He also outperformed Mitt Romney's 2012 margin. And that is something to point out as pretty substantial, because also it is something to say that 2018 was a much more beneficial year for the Democratic Party than 2016 was. Yet Greg Abbott performed better considerably compared to Donald Trump. You're talking about a 4-point increase. And considering that Texas was decided by just 6 percentage points in 2020, 4% truly can make a substantial difference. Now, the thing is now that Greg Abbott is no longer outperforming the previous presidential margin by a significant amount. It shows that polarization, number one, is really getting to voters in the state of Texas. It is narrowing down these margins and crossover voters. I mean, I can't imagine that if Texas was to have a Senate race in 2022, that there would be a substantial amount of Senate Democratic voters and Senate Republican governor voters. I think that would be very hard to see, but something that could be a reality if you go back in time to 2010, 2008, 2018 was probably one of the last times that we see that, primarily because Beto O'Rourke, I think, was an individually strong candidate. And looking at the recent elections beyond 2018, besides Beto O'Rourke being on the ballot, it isn't just Beto O'Rourke making some of these races competitive. What you find is that in 2020, you see that the Democrats, while still winning control of the Senate, lost in the state of Texas, but didn't do so by a super substantial amount. John Cornyn in 2014, if we want to take a look at that Senate election, which we can, because we can just go ahead and jump over to the Senate election results, won by a super substantial amount. John Cornyn in 2014 won with 62% of the vote. He even outperformed Greg Abbott when it came down to this race. He won by nearly 30 percentage points across the state of Texas, and then in 2020 wins by a mere margin of about 9 percentage points. Well, 9 percentage points is traditionally impressive for a swing state. John Cornyn was an institutional candidate. He had won by extremely large margins in the past, as we now see from 2014 when he was the incumbent. I mean, there was no real reason as to why he should not have been decimating the Democrats in this race, especially when MJ Hager wasn't necessarily the strongest GOP candidate. Had the Democrats ran Beto O'Rourke, I would expect it to run similar to where it was on the presidential level, which would still be, good for the GOP because they win another Senate race for the next 6 years. But it also is a race that is going to be really put up there as a moral victory for the Democratic Party if they're able to make it competitive. And the fact that they could do it without Beto O'Rourke being on the ballot, the fact that they could do it without their star-studded, Democratic candidate from 2018 being there, it is a testament to the fact that the Democrats have increased their vote share. There is no denying that at this point in time. So now moving further into the Texas governor's race, what we are going to find is that while Greg Abbott is still pretty likely for victory, it isn't going to be by a substantial amount. I think I grossly overestimated the amount of support that the Republicans had in the state of Texas in one of my recent predictions. This was in November of 2021. And in that November prediction, I said that Texas was going to go by a safe margin. Looking at the other predictions, I never said that. Texas eventually moved over into the safe margin simply because I was expecting the GOP to have a super substantial victory there. That was because I had just seen Jack Ciattarelli nearly win the New Jersey governor's race. That's because I had just seen Glenn Youngkin win the Virginia governor's race. But that always isn't the best indicator. Being completely honest here, there are different states with different priorities and different values. And in the state of Virginia, I wouldn't exactly know if that type of strategy that Glenn Youngkin used would work as well for Greg Abbott, especially since states such as Texas will value different issues more than the state of Virginia might. But at the end of the day, I do think that a likely margin is a fit characterization at this point in time, but moving it down to the lean margin could become a reality in the potential future. If Beto O'Rourke is able to campaign in the state the same way he did in 2018 when Republicans wrote him off as a candidate who could never win, and partially they were correct, but they definitely did not expect him to get this close, I think that it is entirely possible for this race to become more competitive. Greg Abbott isn't some type of scandal-free candidate. He has a lot of baggage on himself, and especially being someone who is now running for a third term. The more you stay in politics, the more dirt accumulates on you, and the more that the opposition has to use against you. And that's what's happening here. That's why 2022 will likely be Greg Abbott's smallest margin of victory. Number one, because the state of Texas is getting bluer, but also number two, because of fatigue and incumbency fatigue. When you have a third time candidate running, people not necessarily want you to be in the governor's office again. There is a time where voters end up rejecting those who are statewide elected officials in a primary simply because they want them to go. They might not necessarily vote for the opposition candidate in the general election against them, though there are voters who will do that. But generally speaking, those like Greg Abbott, those who stay in politics for a substantial period of time, have a very real possibility of being ousted in a primary simply because the length of your term being extended gives people more of an opportunity to dislike you. A lot of the times I think politicians politician legacies and the way that they are resembled in American politics is very much attributed to their term limits in the governor's office or the presidency. Because if they were to run again, it's possible that they could win, but it might end up taint them more than it would actually help them. So, looking at this University of Houston poll, I think that while it isn't the gold standard and shouldn't be taken above all else of all of these other polls from reputable pollsters such as Quinnipiac or the Dallas Morning News or Rice University or UT Texas Tribune, I do want to say that it definitely contributes to this general theme, that the race itself is going to be more competitive than Abbott's 2018 and 2014 race, despite this year being nothing like 2018, or at least as it stands right now. I think that as we move forward and as we move into this election cycle, that it will become more competitive, and I think that it could become one of the most competitive governor races in the country, despite Texas itself previously having a very solid red history, but that seems to not be standing much more, and this poll only further confirms that. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.